I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. Maryland DOT, the Department of Transportation, released the Draft Consolidated Transportation Program. This is the state's transportation capital budget plan. The document opens with a surprising qualifier that it is largely reflective of the previous administration's priorities. So, the Westmore plan looks like the previous Hogan plan. In Maryland, it is common for a new governor's first budget document to continue from what has existed before. There are barely a few days between inauguration and budget submission. But this is the second year, the second budget. The final consolidated plan document isn't due until January 2024, when the General Assembly is back in session. But this is the draft that Marylanders are being asked to weigh in on. I asked the chair of the Maryland House of Delegates Environment and Transportation Committee, Mark Corman, what's going on?
We're not that different. We both go to work. We both pay bills and we shop at the local grocery store. And maybe on weekends we might go to movies or get in the car and take a ride to Baltimore. So I don't know why you think this life I live is strange, but everything I do, you do just about the same.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are dirty, messy, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C. area folk singer-songwriter Stephen Gilman, whose new album, All You Need, released this week. Guest appearances on the album include several members of the folk band Seldom Seen, Nina Gerber, Kathy Fink, and Marcy Markser, and also includes Scottish fiddler Bonnie Rideout. You can find Stephen Gilman's music at hiddenpoet.com.
I'm just like you, you're just like me. Oh, you're just like me.
In the news this week, the federal government narrowly avoided another shutdown over the last weekend. See you in about 45 days, when the game will be played again, albeit now with a new cast of characters. A football game between Kennedy and Northwood high schools ended in the first quarter on September 29th after players began fighting each other. There has been growing attention to fighting around sports events. A recent incident involving Bethesda Chevy Chase and Walter Johnson High School students after a Friday night game resulted in the criminal indictment of several students. The Kennedy-Northwood fight happened on the field itself rather than among spectators and supporters off campus. Fights at high school or around sporting events are hardly new. Our preliminary research shows that local media reported an average of less than one fight at a football game per year over the last 2 decades. There were many years with no reported incidents. But when you speak with students and families, they say that fights have always been common. This raises a question about reporting bias, not in the way we generally think of it as political biases of reporters and editors, but rather due to the ubiquity of smartphones and social media that then leads local media outlets to report on these fights. If you have witnessed fights in the past or recently, please reach out and tell us if you think there has been an increase in the number of fights and why. You can reach us by email at producer@ihppod.org. Montgomery County did not officially permit tunnel-type greenhouses in regular residential home backyards. You could build one in the ag reserve. These are usually plastic-covered aluminum frames in the shape of a tunnel and are used to grow food when it is colder. But now, in an effort to encourage urban gardening, the County Department of Permitting Services is going to allow you to have one anywhere in the county. Because we live in a multi-agency world, you will still need approval from the Montgomery County Soil and Water Conservation District and the County Office of Agriculture. And it does not appear to be a cakewalk to get those approvals. But still, a hesitant first step forward is better than no step at all. I will admit to having one of these in my backyard many, many years ago. I did not know that they were not allowed. One winter, I woke up to the whole thing rolling around in my backyard, a giant umbrella caught in the wind. I hurriedly took off the plastic covering. If you get one, be sure to get some deep stakes into the ground to secure it. In more seasonal news, last week Montgomery County Council passed a ban on gas-powered leaf blowers. With the ban on their sale coming into force July 2024 and the ban on use starting July 2025. The measure passed the council 10-1. The one dissenting vote came from Montgomery County Council member at large Gabe Albanose, and I asked him why.
I learned that there are more than 2,300 landscaping companies that are formally registered in some way in the county that employ at least 11,000, but probably many more employees than that. And when I learned that the Department of Environmental Protection had spoken to approximately 2 of them in the formation of the bill, I don't think that there was enough acknowledgement of the havoc that this is going to reap on the landscaping industry as a whole. The commercial electric blowers are not nearly as strong and cost twice as much. And when you factor in that you have to purchase additional battery packs, can cost us 3 or 4 times as much as gas-powered leaf blowers. And about a quarter of our landscapers make less than $50,000 in revenue every year. And to put these in numbers in context, it costs between $1,500 and $1,700 for a new commercial leaf blower. That's one leaf blower with one battery pack. Every subsequent battery pack is between $400 and $800. And the voucher that we are providing to the landscaping businesses covers up to $500. And we are only making approximately 600 or so available to the landscaping industry. The people that make up a significant majority of the workforce within the landscaping industry are immigrants. And because of a depressingly broken federal immigration system, this is one of the few jobs, that many of our immigrant community can access here to be able to support their families. And this is going to disproportionately impact them.
Amazon can still continue to sell gas-powered leaf blowers in the county, right? That you can't prevent.
Yeah, we have no control over federal commerce, so anything sold online, and of course, all you have to do is go to any other jurisdiction in the region, Howard County, Prince George's County, Northern Virginia, to purchase your gas-powered leaf blower. This just means you can't purchase them in Montgomery County.
What is the enforcement mechanism?
There are 5 officers, 5, like 5 period, not like 5 on, at any given time. No, 5 period, that cover enforcement of all Department of Environmental Protection policies that are covered by them across the entire county. And they, of course, predominantly work 9 to 5. And so they don't work on weekends, they don't work on holidays. It was written into the law that the manner in which it's primarily going to be enforced is encouraging county residents to take pictures of their neighbors or of the landscapers that are actually using the gas-powered leaf blowers, and then submit those pictures to the Department of Environmental Protection. And so what's probably going to happen, and what's happening in DC literally as we speak, as we enter into the fall season, is people call the government, nobody answers, nobody's available, and so then they call the police. The police come, the police are stretched, busy, hopefully focused on other things more important than gas-powered leaf blowers, but still are required statutorily to respond to these calls, and now have to intervene. We also don't know exactly what the fine is going to be yet. That has yet to be determined. So there are a lot of complications with this bill, which is why I ultimately voted against it.
Who determines the fine?
That will be determined by the Department of Environmental Protection.
Is there a chance that you are not weighing the benefits of noise reduction and environmental benefits versus these costs you just brought up?
I think the costs outweigh those environmental benefits in the short term. I think ultimately these will be phased out. They already are beginning to be phased out. But making them and banning them, causing friction among neighbors, and really turning upside down an entire industry, I think, cause for concern. These are not good for our environment. I acknowledge that as well. But there are many more products that we utilize that are as bad or worse for the environment.
If there are several things that need to be done, why not start with the gas blower?
This in the short term is really going to hurt people badly, people who are especially vulnerable. And I think I would have supported a longer runway, that, the ban would have gone into effect instead of 2 years, say 3 or 4 or 5. I supported a ban of sale right away. I also think that moving forward, and it's not just true of this, but so many other issues, we need to start working closely with our local jurisdictions and do this collectively as a whole. Because when Montgomery County gets singled out, it then also creates confusion, not just in the market, but among residents. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to work more cohesively and together with other jurisdictions if we're going to enact policies like this, to not just do it on our own. I completely understand and respect those that felt passionately enough to follow us during the campaign process to various events, demand that we sign a letter, whether we supported them or not. But as I shared with those passionate advocates, the concerns I raised with you are still my same concerns.
You didn't sign the letter, right?
I did not. I did not sign the letter.
Okay, but you lost this one 10-1 overwhelmingly. Why do you think your colleagues chose the environmental side over the cost side?
You'll have to ask my colleagues why they decided to vote for this. Some of them signed the pledge during the campaign process and felt obligated to follow through on that pledge. And some of them, signed the pledge, but signed it without really having had the opportunity to better understand the issue as a whole. But I think we need to take our time, Sunil, on legislation to be able to understand the issues. And while I was ultimately unsuccessful, I was able to secure a a little bit longer of a runway. It was like 6 months, but a little bit longer of a runway. And I think my colleagues, privately expressed appreciation that I raised issues that they were not familiar with or aware of.
Gabe Albornoz, thank you.
Yep. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you, Sunil.
I want to end this news roundup with a remembrance. On August 14th this year, Montgomery County lost a tireless education advocate. Susan Loftus, my dear friend, was an elementary school PE teacher, union leader, and politically as bold as they come. I became friends with Susan during my run for the school board in 2020. To call Susan passionate about children, public education, and teachers would be an understatement. One day she came by my house to show me this gigantic vinyl sticker of our campaign logo, which she had proudly planted on her white VW Bug, as she drove countless miles across the county delivering yard signs. She made sure that we were swagged out with t-shirts and sweatshirts. When COVID put the kibosh on door knocking, she came up with a plan and a list of the county's outdoor farmers markets that I should visit. She was fierce, and she was there every day. Susan was just 59 and leaves a family that includes her wife, Terry Young, her dad, Jerry, and her sweet pups, Peanut and Hannah, and a giant community of people who loved her. Today, October 6th, Susan's family has organized a celebration of her life. If you would like to join, I'll have information on my personal and the podcast social media feeds. I'll be back with Maryland House Environment and Transportation Chair Mark Corman.
All the light is left here, and the rain is pouring down. I feel like some beat-up toy left in the lost and found. I long for sandy beaches in the roar of ocean sound, from tall cliffs with redwood trees in the lovely northern towns of California, 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 California.
Mark Corman, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thanks for having me.
The Maryland Department of Transportation just released its Consolidated Transportation Program, which is the state's transportation capital budget plan. What concerned me most was this sentence in the draft, which said the draft CTP, the Consolidated Transportation Program, is largely reflective of the previous administration's priorities and does not include all the projects necessary to truly build a better transportation system for all Marylanders. This is the second budget that the Moore administration is presenting. Why does the new transportation plan reflect the priorities of the previous administration?
Yeah, I mean, that stuck out to me as well. And, I will say that obviously putting together, the Consolidated Transportation Program, which is, in the tens of billions of dollars, over the course of it, is complicated. What it really does is demonstrates the depth of the problem, because another year of the Governor Hogan transportation program doesn't include the red line, right? It doesn't include, and the red line, when I say the red line, you and I live in Montgomery County, but I mean the Baltimore City proposed east-west transit line. It doesn't include, significant money for MARC rail improvements that, the governor's team has spoken about. It actually doesn't even include money for the American Legion Bridge that the, governor wants to replace. That's a bit of sleight of hand that Larry Hogan had, that he said it was going to cost no money. This governor's acknowledged there will be a cost to this project, but it's not accounted for in the CTP. So
It's really worrisome that these major things, the Baltimore Red Line, the Mark Rail improvement, the American Legion Bridge, they're just like the signature projects that the governor has wanted, but they are not making it into the capital budget plan.
yeah, I mean, look, I think it's they took an unusual approach here. They'll tell you they took an unusual approach. I mean, I've seen Secretary Wiedefeld speak to 2 audiences in the past 2 days about how they took an unusual approach here, and usually the draft they submit is balanced to start, let alone reflecting the priorities of the current administration. Again, they'll have to submit a final CTP in January when they put the state budget in, and I expect at that time it will, one, be balanced, and two, reflect more of the priorities of the Moore administration and not the prior administration.
Well, then how does this process really work? We are supposed to respond, the Maryland citizens are supposed to respond to the draft. And the draft is not a complete draft. So what on earth are we responding to?
Yeah, I mean, this goes to a broader issue, which is not a Moore administration issue. It long predates them, which is how we assemble the transportation budget and set the transportation priorities and what we're asking people to weigh in on. As you know, every county and the city of Baltimore submit what's called a priority letter to the Department of Transportation. In theory, that happens every year. It doesn't always happen every year. You can find them all on a website. It's very transparent, but you'll see many gaps in years from many of the different counties. You'll also notice immediately that everybody's looks different. Some rank, their top transportation priorities of any kind, 1 through 10, whether it's a local bus, intersection improvement, money for a trail, whatever, they put it all in one list. Others break it into road projects, transit projects, and then, sort of recreational projects or sort of different kinds of multimodal projects like trails. Some have very long introductory sections that are really asking for hundreds of billions of dollars in investment before they get to their ranking. And so all that is done in a very odd way. And then the Department of Transportation goes on this consolidated transportation program tour to each county where they're supposed to get feedback. I would submit to you, and again, this is a process that Governor Moore inherited, so this is not, a Moore MDOT problem, a Moore department problem, that process doesn't really work. And it's certainly not transparent because we really have no idea what the department is taking into account from that feedback when it comes out with its final transportation program in January. And in fact, in many years, there's not much difference between the draft and the final. So you kind of wonder what all that, touring around, was really for, other than some polite conversations.
Let's talk a little bit about the aggregate revenue situation. What is the nature of the gaps? How much is it? What are you concerned about?
I'm not saying everything has to be, handled just on the revenue side. There's also an expense side that you can deal with, and that's sort of part of the need to prioritize. That said, just in the CTP they put out, which, as we noted, does not include a number of large-scale projects, there's over $1 billion gap, over the course of several, years. It starts out relatively small in the next budget year, and then it sort of grows. We're a little bit unusual in that all of our sort of transportation modes, they call them transportation business units, are under one consolidated department, and all the money goes into one consolidated transportation trust fund. In many states, they separate highway and transit. They don't have a state port and a state airport, all part of the same mix. Those things are more separated out. So we have a very large consolidated transportation program. Almost a quarter of the revenue comes from state gas tax revenue. It's obviously a significant source. It's probably the second biggest after federal aid in terms of where we get the funding from, and that source is having a bit of erosion over time as things change. One thing that's already been changing is increased mileage, right? So cars have much better mileage now. They burn less fuel. You're buying less fuel. Those are good things. You pay less gas tax revenue. That's good for the individual and their family, but creates a macro budget problem. Then the other thing that's starting to, tick up a little bit, but, I think we're expecting in future years to have even more of an impact, is the shift to zero emission vehicles, where they don't need to fuel up at all, or if they're a hybrid, they need to fuel up extremely rarely. And so that'll be a kind of a significant loss in revenue, and that's just eroding the current revenue. I would say one positive note I would just say is we've dealt with this before. This has happened in other parts of our economy and our tax base, particularly the sales tax, where the sales tax, there was some erosion because a lot of things we used to buy as physical goods became digital. I don't know the last time you bought a DVD or a CD, but I'm confident within the past few weeks you were on Netflix or Spotify or whatever you use. And we made the decision about 4 years ago to begin applying the sales tax to those digital items, and it was really the reason it had bipartisan support, at least in the Maryland State Senate, was because it was a tax replacement issue more than a new tax issue. Now, I'm not saying that solves all problems, but it is interesting that when it comes to this motor fuel tax issue, we do have sort of an analogous situation we've already partially dealt with in the state.
Right. So in the case of a gas tax fix, what is the replacement here?
Well, I mean, I can give you sort of my opinion, but I think there's lots of different ideas of what you could do. I mean, the big policy wonk, right? Like the kind of thing that would be a whole hour on I Hate Politics, where you would get some national expert to talk about, is what's called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. It's a big buzzword, and it basically would, charge people by the mile for their driving. The average Maryland driver pays somewhere between $300 and $350 in state gas taxes per year. And in the aggregate, that's a lot of money. And if I had to pay that at one time, if most families had to pay that at one time, it's a lot of money. For some families, even paying it out over longer periods of time, it's a lot of money. But it's not, it's for most families paid out over time. I don't think it's crippling. But I question whether a VMT apparatus is the right way to replicate what turns out to be a relatively small amount of revenue per Maryland driver. It might be. I mean, I think it's worthy of discussion and exploration, but there might be other things we can do. We might be able to sort of replicate that using, an MVA billing system of some kind, where, the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration already is mailing you, a note every 2 years asking for you to pay them some money for a registration. We could change that system to, kind of replicate more of the gas tax for non-gas vehicle drivers.
Do you think that the Moore administration, the Department of Transportation, is thinking about these things?
The governor signed a piece of legislation last year from my colleague Senator McCray, or last session from my colleague Senator McCray, that had a number of elements, but one of it was setting up a so-called Blue Ribbon Commission, Transportation Revenue and Investment Needs Commission. If you work out the acronym, it's the TRAIN Commission. And the department's extremely involved in that. I mean, Secretary Wiedefeld sits on that commission along with the Maryland Transit Administrator, Holly Arnold, the Motor Vehicle Administrator, Chrissy Nizer, and then, people from the department staff that commission along with folks in the Department of Legislative Services. So I think the idea is that commission is going to sort of work through some of these ideas. It started meeting about a month and a half ago. Our next meeting is later in October. But so I think, I do think these ideas are being thought about, but they need to be further developed, to be sure.
Okay, let's talk about projects. In terms of the American Legion Bridge, the 495 to 270, and then the spur to 370, and then north of 370. So there are several parts to this, right?
I'm going off the top of my head here, Sunil, but they're both, in the $100 to $200 million range in the budget, which is some, significant amount of money to you and I, not really, moving the needle on, building or expanding a bridge and, multiple roads, right? So those are billions of dollars projects, not 100 to 200 million. So the money that's in the plan currently is really just for some planning, right? They're not,
right.
They're not the significant investment you're going to need to actually do these projects. And so there's a huge sort of unfunded need there.
Okay, so the Moore administration has applied for a grant from the federal government to fund part of this, right? Is that their plan?
For multiple years, Governor Hogan said this will cost no tax dollars. And by the end of his administration, he realized that was not really practical and did apply for a bridge grant from the federal government, which was denied. So Governor Hogan, sought this infrastructure money and did not obtain it. Governor Moore is reinvigorating that process and trying to seek robust federal support for this project. But it's not realistic to think it's going to be entirely paid for by the federal government. It will still require significant state resources.
The state did not get the $2 billion that Governor Hogan asked for. But now the expectation is that the state will get $6 billion for a similar project. I mean, is that realistic? And if it's not realistic, where is the money going to come from?
Well, I mean, you should invite on a representative of the Maryland Department of Transportation if you want sort of their plan for how to do this specific project, because I've shared.
Are you convinced with their plan, though?
I will say that I think they've taken a more deliberate, realistic view of obtaining federal funding, which oftentimes for a mega project like this does not happen the first time you apply for that funding. So if you're looking for funding in the billions of dollars, sometimes that's a process.
What is the chance that we have to go back to a public-private partnership that was how Governor Hogan had envisioned the project?
I can't answer that. I don't know that anybody knows that with any certainty. I will say, though, that public-private partnerships are financing mechanisms, right? So they're basically a way to borrow money in different ways to build projects. They can sort of help you get the stack together of funding you need for a project. Other times, it might just make sense for us to issue the bonds ourselves with the Maryland Transportation Authority with a combination of federal funds. We now have a mechanism for some projects in the state called Garvey funding. I mean, there's lots of different options.
Now, one thing that the Moore administration has done is to decouple the bridge from the 495 expansion, from the expansion further up north. And they have taken a different approach. Is that correct? Or is it, the same plan as the old one? Well,
I mean, they have tweaks to their plan, and I expect that we'll hear more from them. One big change I think we have seen is, they have sort of put separately into the plan the sort of north of 370 part of 270. And, I think that's important. I think that's important for Upcounty Montgomery. I think that's important for Frederick. I would say if we're going to make changes to the road up there, it should be concurrent with equal investment in transit options in that direction. Particularly the Brunswick line, I think, is a good candidate for that, since it's already a rail line that runs in that direction.
One of the key problems with expanding MARC is the relationship that the state has with CSX. And that has been a consistent sort of area of tension. Will CSX let you run trains on their tracks that were built by public money? Have you thought about how those might be resolved, quite apart from, what is in the CTP and where we're going with it?
Sure. So first of all, those things are tied together, because if you're going to do more on the Brunswick line, you need investment. So you need money from the transportation budget. In Maryland, it's not just CSX, although where you and I live, the Brunswick line is CSX, the Camden line is CSX, but the Penn line is Amtrak. They're this kind of landlord on the Penn line. Let me also say the legislature's part-time. I've done legal work in my day job for CSX, although never in Maryland or anything involving Maryland, but I do like to disclose that. This is an issue everywhere, because in most of the country, commuter rail and passenger rail runs on the lines of the freight railroads. So it's a challenge everybody faces. There were some efforts of this under the prior administration, but I will say, when Greg Slater was appointed transportation secretary, he was Governor Hogan's second transportation secretary. He said in a public hearing, he didn't even know he was allowed to talk to CSX until there was an announcement out of Virginia, right? So we're a little behind what other states have been doing and the communication they've had with their kind of landlords when it comes to these rail lines. We passed a piece of legislation 2 years ago now, sponsored by Delegate Solomon in the House and Senator Vital in the other body, that required the Maryland Department of Transportation to sort of advance some specific rail projects. And I think that, along with a new governor, has helped kind of reinvigorate the state's incentives to negotiate with our partners. And of course, like I said, it's not only CSX, it's also Amtrak, although less so where you and I live. And of course, there's a great partnership happening with Amtrak in the city of Baltimore and the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which will also be very helpful for MARC rail service going through the city of Baltimore.
Frederick Douglass Tunnel, that's not in the CTP. Where's the money?
Right. So yeah, no, the state does have I believe, $150 million commitment that it has to fulfill there, and that is something that will have to be included in future year budgets. You're correct.
It's the Frederick Douglass Tunnel. I think you mentioned the Kim Laffer Bikeway, several other projects like this. I mean, we are looking at hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah,
so the Kim Laffer's Bikeways program, which is a great program that supports local bike projects throughout the state, is very frustrating for me personally, only because if you look at the budget, it zeroes out in future years. And that's not going to happen. And part of the reason I know it's not going to happen is we've actually been in this spot before. Prior CTPs under the prior administration did the same thing. They pretended it was going to zero out in future budget years, which is really just kind of a budget shell game, and not really transparent with our budget choices. So I'm confident
that's why it's so frustrating, though. That's why the whole thing is so frustrating to read, because you realize that this was not supposed to be done the same way it was done for a bunch of years prior.
Yeah, well, we'll get there. I mean, there's more work to be done, but again, they get to submit this final CTP in January, and they've been, great partners on this funding commission. And, again, Governor Moore, in my view, has, really spoken up, as he goes around the state in support of many of the right products and priorities. And now the documentation just needs to catch up with it.
Governor Moore has said repeatedly, they are going to be hard choices to make. So he speaks about the projects, but also says that there are real hard choices coming down the pike. That reconciliation needs to be done.
Look, I'm cards on the table. I think we need more revenue. I think there's ways we need to do that. And I think Marylanders overall, not the people who are going to blog about this statement, but Marylanders overall understand that the investments we want to make cost dollars. That said, I think the place to start is by looking at the existing projects and program and say, are these really the things we want to do? Or are we going to reprioritize now that we have a new administration with a different set of priorities than we had for the prior 8 years?
Okay. We beat up on them enough, I think. What are you happy with in the CTP?
So first of all, I don't want to beat up at them at all, because I think, as I said, Governor Moore has gone around the state talking about the right projects and the right priorities. And, in a way, the bureaucracy needs to catch up with them. Governor Moore doesn't sit down and write the, multi-100-page consolidated transportation program himself. That's not his job. His job is to set out the vision and talk about what his priorities are. I think he's done a really good job of that. As you know, he was walking around in Wheaton a few months ago with Natty Fanning Gonzalez on the county council, talking about the need for pedestrian improvements. I've been with him in downtown Bethesda, talking about the need for Metro and support for the Purple Line. So I want to be really clear. I think Governor Moore has laid out the right things. The paperwork needs to follow the governor.
All right. Maybe talk a little bit about the Complete Streets project. Seems like they have funded that.
Yeah, no, they've put some money in the budget for Complete Streets, and I think Secretary Wiedefeld has suggested that more could be coming in some specific focus areas. Where we know we need improvement there. And you just hear it in the rhetoric. Look, I mean, it was just, you did not hear from the prior governor that, Vision Zero, I know important priority of yours, and you're always asking, where's the bill? Where's the bill? The county council actually passed one recently, so I don't know, maybe you'll have to do a mea culpa, but the bill in this case, to me, it's not really a piece of legislation, although there's more we can do on the legislative front. It's also paying the bill for the infrastructure changes that are necessary to make streets safer. And they have made a down payment on that in the current draft. And again, it's not just what's in the draft so far, although I'd like to see that improved. It's also in what they've been saying, and the priorities they've been letting out, I think have been very, very good in this direction.
We did an episode on the Safe Streets Act already in July.
Did you, at the time, did you say, I've been asking for the bill and here it is?
Well, I think you should go back and listen. And I'd say that to all the other listeners.
I usually listen. I must have been on vacation or something that week.
Yeah, it could be. But it was an opportunity. And I think it was a little bit of a lost opportunity because of the way it was structured in the end. Corridor Cities Transitway. Perennial presence and absence is like a ghost project. Still is?
Yeah, a number of years ago, the Hogan administration attempted to remove it entirely from the Consolidated Transportation Program through a pretty large organizing effort of elected officials and business leaders and others. They sort of agreed to keep it in, but it exists as something of a zombie at this point. You're right. So it's still in there. It's still kind of available as a vehicle to be funded, but there's no money budgeted for it. It's just a page in the document.
I'm going to end with a philosophical question. The Purple Line went from being $2 billion to being $7 billion over a bunch of years for a variety of reasons. And through this entire time, advocates of the Purple Line, including you, including me, we have stuck with supporting it. The question I have to ask you is, are large infrastructure projects supported for incalculable reasons?
Yeah, philosophically, yes, I agree with that. I would also just want to point out that there are a couple of really big cost drivers on the Purple Line that we hopefully won't see replicated elsewhere, including impacts of COVID, impacts of a contractor walking away, and also, was it ever really $2 billion? Because the prior administration put in what they thought were some very, smart, cost-saving measures early on, and a lot of them turned out to be illusory, and we're now paying for them. So it's also a question of being transparent and honest upfront with what things are going to cost.
Mark Corman, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me again.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with the wrap-up, including lessons from my conversation with Maryland House Environment and Transportation Committee Chair Mark Corman.
You got up today, made your bed, brushed your teeth, and you called a friend. Little victories, little victories.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Mark Corman, Maryland House of Delegates, Environment and Transportation Chair? First, it is truly puzzling why Governor Moore's second transportation capital budget draft leans so heavily and explicitly on the priorities of his predecessor, Larry Hogan. Mark Corman says that the final document, which is due in January 2024, will be more in line with Governor Moore's priorities, and that the process is complex, including aggregating transportation priority letters from each of the state's 25 counties. The current draft, as it exists, excludes big-ticket items such as the American Legion Bridge, the Baltimore Red Line, two projects that the governor has personally talked up in public. The draft is also missing funding for the Frederick Douglass Tunnel in Baltimore and Kim Lafayette Bikeways program. But if the draft is missing these key elements, what should county transportation priority letters include? How might counties harmonize their asks with the priorities of the state under this new governor. The governor personally does not write the budget document, but he needs to make sure that it gets done. Second, Maryland's ask from the federal government for $6 billion for a new American Legion bridge is uncertain at best. Mark Corman says that big asks like this are not always successful the first time around, and state officials need to build a relationship with federal agencies to successfully win these grants. The other alternative is for the Moore administration to go back to Hogan's plan for a public-private partnership, the dreaded P3 model, which after the experience of the Purple Line is a scary thought. Governor Moore has also been issuing public warnings about coming hard choices, which I think means that state finances may not be enough to support all projects. To me, sitting outside, the financing is making the American Legion Bridge project look more and more like a second-term one. Transportation budget planning is not the only policy area where the new governor seems to have taken a hands-off approach. Education, environment, and cybersecurity have seen similarly delegated managerial style. In contrast, Moore's service year program for the state's young people appears to have taken off quite well, and the governor is said to be working on an economic development proposal for the state. Different governors, presidents, chief executives have different leadership styles. And in Governor Moore's case, he has not previously served in government, so the learning curve for him would be steeper. As the second General Assembly office term draws near, the administration's prep work for those intense 90 days can tell us if the Moore method is likely to deliver on policy objectives. Third, perhaps as important as any project in the CTP is a prospect of falling gas tax revenue that is expected to diminish the state's Consolidated Transportation Trust Fund. A transportation revenue task force is looking at ways out of the jam. What it decides to do, taxing vehicle miles traveled, for example, could become vulnerable to criticism like the one former Governor Hogan made against the so-called rain tax. Lastly, as luck would have it, a friend of the show from a Purple Line neighborhood has some advice for the Baltimore Red Line project.
Hi, Sunil. This is Annie Tolkien from the Long Branch neighborhood in Silver Spring in Montgomery County. I've been tracking the wonderful developments and input sessions around the Red Line in Baltimore. The Red Line can't come soon enough, in my opinion. However, I think the state needs to take a critical look at the Purple Line and study the highs and lows of this project before embarking on the Red Line project. I'm hoping that our legislators will fund and retain an outside evaluator to look at the Purple Line project and to make recommendations to inform the Red Line project. I understand that this sort of thing is usually not done with a project ongoing, but I'm concerned the Red Line planning will move ahead without incorporating any of the lessons learned from the Purple Line project. I'd like to save my friends in Baltimore from enduring the same mistakes that have been made with the Purple Line project. My idea is to get the delegates in Purple Line areas and the delegates in Red Line areas together and propose something. That's as far as I've gotten, but now I've recorded this, so hopefully it will live on and something will happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Annie. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producer Daniel Galileo, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from DC area folk singer-songwriter Steven Gelman, whose new album, All You Need, released this week. Guest appearances on the album include several members of the folk band Seldom Seen, Nina Gerber, Kathy Fenk, and Marcy Marxer, and also includes Scottish fiddler Bonnie Rideout. You can find Steven Gelman's music at hiddenpoet.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
My story is now half told. I just want to sleep, watch TV and eat. My memory's gone. I can't remember the words to my own songs, but in my mind, I'm still 29. I remember this guy. He had such dreams. They were not to be denied. I wanna tell him that some will come true, but most of them, they gotta fall right through. When did I get old? And my story is now half told. I just wanna sleep, read my books and eat. My memory's gone. I can't remember the words to my own songs, but in my mind, I'm still 29. 29. Well, that was then, and those days are gone. I need to accept and just move along. I can't do all the things I used to, but I still try to be that guy. When did I get old? My story is now half told. I just wanna sleep, play guitar and eat. My memory's gone. I can't remember the words to my own songs, but in my mind, I'm still 29.